with colleagues exploring these various issues as we get ready for the great unknown that I think many of us, if not all of us, are hopeful is about to happen. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Nevada perspective on this issue. As we've heard, certainly throughout the day, many of our states are proud to talk about the fact that they are an auto manufacturing state. Nevada is also an auto manufacturing state, but we manufacture only EVs with our Tesla Gigafactory that we have. So because of that, going back to the prior administration, Nevada has the Nevada Electric Highway, which is our own effort to electrify corridors in Nevada, US 50, US 95, US 93, as well as Interstate 15 and Interstate 80. And so if you're familiar at all with Nevada, you understand that it is one of the most urbanized states in the country, and yet it also has these vast rural stretches of highway that present all kinds of interesting challenges when it comes to electrification of transportation. But I think through that, this of course being our use of the Volkswagen settlement money, our office, the Governor's Office of Energy, in partnering with rural electric co-ops, our investor-owned utility, MV Energy, various host sites to place these chargers. We've learned a lot of lessons, and we're still learning lessons about, the sorts of upgrades that have to happen to the electrical system to make this charging happen. For instance, we have one particular site owner that was concerned about demand charges. We were not that concerned, but in an effort to bring them over, we decided to say, hey, if you do incur any charges, we'll have a set-aside pot of money to help you with that to cover the cost. Thankfully, we haven't had to use it, but it's a real concern, and it's something that I'm sure we'll hear about. We have remote sites. We have one site right now that we're deploying off-grid technology with batteries and solar to provide for some pretty rural charging. And then also the charging models themselves. Phase one of the Nevada Electric Highway was really to connect Reno to Las Vegas on US 95. And for those sites, the requirement for the host was that they had to, for a period of time, keep those chargers publicly available and essentially free. No charging for anything, no charging for the charging. But then for phase two, we opened it up and to a more agnostic posture as to how host sites might pursue charging for the charging. So we know that that is an area that is related to this topic as well that hopefully we'll hear from. And then I think looking ahead to what's coming at us, before we get to the infrastructure bill, we've heard a lot about that, but this last legislative session featured SB 448, which was an omnibus energy bill that, among other things, included a requirement for our investor-owned utility, MV Energy, to submit a transportation electrification plan. It is a $100 million spend. It was just filed with the Public Utilities Commission. Interesting to note from the equity perspective, it requires 40% of the investment be in low to moderate income neighborhoods. And so that's really interesting, but it also presents, again, another set of questions as to what sorts of upgrades the company foresees needing to make, the various tariff approaches, et cetera, to really make the most of this sort of investment. And, we really in Nevada, not only do we see our efforts to transform transportation as playing to our economic strength as an auto manufacturing state, but also the fact that we don't have domestic, at least not of any significance, domestic fossil fuel resources. So we like to point out that, gasoline that comes in to power transportation currently, we're importing that. That is not an energy source that comes from Nevada. We do solar, we do geothermal, and so we're, very bullish on this opportunity to play to our economic strengths when it comes to energy and transportation electrification. So I think with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists so that we can dive into these topics. We have with us today Jeffrey Springer, who's the Manager of Innovation and Efficient Electrification with Dairyland Power Cooperative. We have Simon Horton, who's Senior Project Manager, Transportation Electrification, Southern California Edison. We have Karl Popham, who is manager of electric vehicles and emerging technologies at Austin Energy. And we have Stacy Noblet, who's the senior director of transportation electrification at ICF. And Stacy, I'd like to start with you, if we could. So please kick us off.
Sure. I hope you're not just picking on me because I'm the only other air traffic controller in the group with my headset. Thanks, David, and it's great to be here. Thanks, NASEO, for the invitation. I hope to contribute to today's conversation, just drawing some insight from ICF's role in program planning, design, and implementation for utilities in particular, as well as just generally trying to keep up with what everyone is doing to better inform our projects. So at a high level, and hopefully Dylan or Cassie can pull up one visual that I'll share with you while we're talking here. At a high level, I'd like to tee up some of what's happening across the country from the utilities perspective. We're drawing data from our friends at Atlas Public Policy through their EV Hub to illustrate a couple of points. So first, many utilities are pursuing EV charging programs. You can see the count of filings. This is 61 utilities in 34 states that have filed some sort of program. And that means we're not just talking about California, although we've got some great examples from Simon with SoCal Edison. But at this point, some of the earliest programs, including SCEs that may have started in pilot phase, are now in second and third iteration. So a lot of learnings coming out of those, and even just watching those programs evolve is very interesting. The stats that I'm showing here are focused on investor-owned utilities, so they don't include the great work of municipal utilities and cooperatives, but luckily we have representatives from all of these categories on the panel today, so we'll get some good perspective. In terms of approvals, since 2012, utility commissions across the country have approved, at this point, more than $3 billion with a B dollars in transportation electrification investment by investor-owned utilities. And so there is a fairly high approval rate, about 80%. And what that means, if we're talking, just boil it down from a regulatory landscape, is that more utility commissions or the bodies that, ultimately need to approve these filings are aware of the need for utility involvement in some way in transportation. It's certainly outside of what any commission has dealt with before, a lot of opportunity for education and engagement. As David mentioned, some states are requiring utilities to develop transportation electrification plans, and that might be generated by the utility commission or by the state legislature, depending on the state. So next, I wanted to introduce a little bit of vocabulary. In the center graph here, just kind of gives you a breakdown of, if you were to segment the filings that have gone in, what ultimately the utility is trying to do with those programs. And the majority is focused on the EV charging itself. I'll get into, kind of some subcategories, but you also have education, which is extremely important. Rates, I know we'll talk about in a little bit. And then, kind of some funds, of course, to actually make these programs run, which is very important. A few utilities are involved in actually incentivizing vehicle purchases, but by and large, we're talking about the infrastructure. What's not necessarily shown here, except in text, is that managed charging is very important. As more EVs are on the grid, utilities are certainly in a position to take that load and move it to the time of day that's most beneficial for their customers, depending on the territory. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. Other kind of trends are prioritizing underserved communities, which is very important, making sure equal access to not only the technology, but the benefits. More of a focus of medium and heavy duty than in the early years. And of course, that's a product of just vehicle offerings being more available. Lastly, just to set the stage, I mentioned that pretty high approval rate within that EVSE category. I've kind of tried to show what the breakdown of program types are. So you have plenty of utilities providing incentives for the EV charging itself. Some are also involved in actually owning and operating those charging stations, be they public or some other application or use case. Make ready is very become most popular as far as program design, and that's ultimately the utility being involved in incentivizing the infrastructure up to the charging station. And then a few, and the 100% is maybe a misleading because there's really only a handful of the line extensions, but providing some sort of allowance or waiver to decrease the price of actually extending the line to enable EV charging. A couple just notes there with regard to make ready. The definition of what that is differs from utility to utility. Some include the meter, some don't. So each program looks a little bit different. But hopefully that kind of sets the stage a bit as we get into more specific discussion. I wanted to kind of explain a little bit more about how utilities are involved, and we'll hear more specific examples from the rest of the panel. So thanks, David.
Thanks, Stacy. And up next, Jeff, let's hear about what this looks like in your world.
Sure, and if someone can cue up the slides, that'd be great in the meantime. I only have a couple of slides, but it will help to illustrate things. And I want to thank NASEO and Cassie for thinking of electric cooperatives when thinking of EV charging. That doesn't always happen. So here on this slide, you can kind of see the service area that Dairyland Power serves. We serve 24 distribution cooperatives in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. And in 2020, those cooperatives came together with 6 others in the state of Wisconsin to form Charge. And the idea was to work together on charging infrastructure instead of being 24 different utilities or 30 different utilities working together to do a common program and do in-home and public fast charge locations as well. The goal of that is to enable EV ownership in rural areas because people want to see chargers in their rural areas to have confidence that they can buy a car and find a place to charge it, but also to enable EV owners from outside of our rural areas to visit us. We may not serve the most populated areas of the country, but we certainly serve some of the most beautiful, and folks do want to visit those areas. It's pretty uncommon to see a cabin by the lake in a city. You always see those out in the rural areas, and those are some of the things that we serve. So if the next slide, please. And while we're very small in size, as far as utility size, we do serve a huge area of the United States. So this is the sort of footprint of electric cooperatives in the United States. And Charge is working to engage more of the cooperatives in the United States to kind of come up with a unified charging network in rural areas so that people have a common way that they can charge their cars, and remembering to include these rural areas in infrastructure planning as, I guess, kind of my suggestion to this group of state regulators and planners. And that's really all I had for an introduction.
Thank you, Jeff. And next, we're going to turn to Karl to talk to us about what this looks like in Austin.
Hello, everyone. And Cassie, if you can pull up the slide. Karl Popham with Austin Energy. We are the 3rd largest city-owned utility, so we're public power as well. But our challenges are different. We're a very high-growth city. Last census has about 170 new people per day come into our territory. So when you look at the correlation between cars and people, we're almost 1 person per 1 car registration in our 2-county area. And then on average, 2.1, 2.4 people per household. That's about 80 homes you need to accommodate per day. So my first visual is just the team. I'm just talking about their work and what they do. I'm just the manager who gets to kind of brag about them. And so I just want to give a shout out to the team. And then what is kind of unique probably about Austin Energy's program is we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary. Having a 10-year anniversary for electric vehicles and emerging technologies team is probably pretty rare. And next slide. And so part of what that has allowed us to do, that I guess history, is really do a lot. I guess what would define the Austin Energy program of how wide a net it is. We have over 25 initiatives, and they're spread out as we have a strategy called the 5 EV pillars. So strategy on projects around charging infrastructure. So we have 1,200 public charging ports and growing. We just launched our DC Fast network. Those 1,200 charging ports are tied to a $417 per month unlimited fill up as well. And it's backed by West Texas Wind through our Green Choice program. And some from the earlier comments, there seems to be a lot of emphasis from utilities in charging infrastructure. And that's a lot of times where people start. My advice is generally probably start with outreach and education. So you kind of see that slide over and start having a strategic vision. But the second pillar, affordability and equity, we just reached about 5 years of our EVs for Everyone program. And it's really important, that the lesson I learned there is every program should start with, an idea, and then you engage a community and see, hey, does this work, and make it their idea. I see a lot of missteps where utilities think they know the answer, and it's all about, if we just make it this price, we build it, they will come. That is the best way to fail on your affordability and equity programs, in my opinion. So we've launched a lot of interest. A lot of it's around e-bikes or safety training, free helmets, even ensuring all this bike infrastructure investment is seen as a opportunity or infrastructure for them. And a lot of communities look at that as a form of gentrification. So really trying to flip the switch on what infrastructure means and what mobility means. Fleets and new mobility, pillar number 3. We are working with Cap Metro. Our local transit authority says they'll never buy a fossil fuel bus again. There are 12 buses and growing, and we just finished out a North Ops fueling depot. And then walking the talk, we're electrifying our own city fleet. And what we're on track to save the city $3.5 million over 10 years over the first batch of 331 EVs. We're 255 and growing, but due to savings in fuel and maintenance. So you no longer have to choose between savings or going green or a leadership position in EVs. We're already showing today a significant per EV savings, and that includes the infrastructure cost. And then outreach and education, I would encourage you to check out ev.austinenergy.com. That's our community buyer's guide. It has real-time pricing information, incentives, real-time inventory of the local dealerships. Or if you just want to learn more about our programs, plug in austin.com. And my advice to my peer group utilities, if you don't have a leadership position, if you're not being proactive, the old adage, you're either on the table or at the table, you're going to be on the table and have to deal with a lot of unintended consequences in your business model if you're not starting to push where your leadership thought is. And then lastly, grid integration. We do have an active vehicle to grid demonstration as part of a larger project called Austin Shines. We have a residential time of use off-peak charging program called EV360, and we're launching and we've had demand response programs as well with EV charging linked to thermostats. And last slide. And that's really it. If any of these items piqued your interest, you want to know how to launch it in your program, to include EVs for schools, which is pretty much a no cost. We put in the public domain, pretty popular program, went from 4 schools to 122 in Central Texas very rapidly, or anything else you heard, I'd be happy to talk to how you can kind of roll this out in your community. Same thing with the buyer's guide. That's pretty shovel ready as well. So that's my opening thoughts.
Thank you, Karl. Simon, how does this look in Southern California?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing in California. I just have a very basic slide with some contact information that can be put up there, but I'm going to voice over all of the exciting things that we're doing here in Southern California and in the state in general. We're very fortunate to have a progressive atmosphere here, looking forward to an EV transition and a zero emission transition in the transportation sector. We began with some very forward-thinking pilot programs in our Charge Ready light-duty program and some small pilots in the medium and heavy-duty space, and have built upon that now to have 2 of the largest, or I believe the largest, utility-led EV programs in the country. Our Charge Ready light-duty program, which seeks to install nearly 38,000 ports over the next 5 years in our service territory for light-duty charging, with a heavy focus on disadvantaged communities, multifamily, really trying to build up that equity component. And then in the medium and heavy-duty space, our Charge Ready transport program seeks to electrify nearly 9,000 medium and heavy-duty trucks in our service territory. And that's really focusing again on those disadvantaged community areas, the corridors from our ports. We have one of the largest port complexes in the country. And so really focusing on those transportation corridors out of the port to our Inland Empire logistics areas. We are already fortunate to have taken on some very large projects to support that. Just recently, some of you may have seen in the news the largest deployment of Class 8 EV tractors being deployed in our service territory, with 2 deployments of 50 each to fully electrify 2 fleets that are running drayage routes from the Port of Long Beach out to the Inland Empire. And so those are really exciting projects that are going to have a significant impact on those heavily impacted transportation corridors. In addition to that, we've looked at how we can address rate design to help make that transition to EV more palatable, and really help particularly on a fleet operator basis, help them manage fuel costs and really understand what that fuel cost looks like as they make that transition, knowing full well that they're likely not making a full transition on day one. They're doing a phased approach over a procurement period of maybe 8 to 10 years for their fleet. And then in the passenger and light duty car market, in addition to our Charge Ready Light Duty program, like I said, where we're trying to install as many as 38,000 ports throughout our territory, we also have a program working specifically with K-12 schools to install chargers at the K-12 school locations throughout our territory, and another one with the California State Park System to provide publicly available charging in state parks throughout our service territory. And then finally, the other important thing that I'd like to mention are our rebate and reward opportunities for vehicle purchase. Started with our Clean Fuel Reward Program for EV purchase, but what we're very excited about now is we've recently launched the statewide on-the-hood used EV rebate opportunity. And we think that's going to have a real impact and partner well with our outreach in the disadvantaged community areas, and really help with that equity component to make EV adoption really even and equitable across all sectors throughout California. So we're very excited about that one as well. So happy to participate today. Looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Simon. And I think with that, we'll get into some questions. And Karl, I'm going to turn to you first. We've certainly been hearing about a lot of exciting programs to move the market, including just now from Simon, and certainly there's a lot happening in Austin. But with that, we also need to focus, of course, on the electric system in terms of the upgrades that are needed, and then also what regulatory and policy support we need to be supportive of EV infrastructure rollout. So what grid or distribution system challenges do you anticipate from wide EV adoption, and what is your utility doing to address those challenges?
Well, from the grid aspect, I think the real difference is between rural and urban utilities. We are a very dense urban utility. And so even looking at DC fast charging hubs, it just adds more density to an already dense grid. And that is just part of business as usual for us. So even a 1, 2, 3 megawatt DC fast hub is equivalent to kind of a building, downtown or something, but it is increasing the density. We have done several pilots and projects to help manage the grid impact. So I kind of teased a little bit on my opening comments. So EV 360 is a residential program to encourage people to charge off peak. It's fully subscribed. And what we found from that is people are very willing to move their EV charging, especially compared to traditional shift of load here in Texas, is you shift air conditioning. When you shift air conditioning with customers, you get a certain percentage of opt-out. People get a little warm and they're just, not really relation to what's happening in the grid. They're going to turn down and be cool. But what we found is during our pilots, we have 0 opt-outs during a demand response pilot for EV charging. Also in our EV 360 rate, it works 100% of the time with 99% of the people. We have just one guy that just doesn't care. And that's a very punitive 40 cents a kilowatt hour if you charge during peak. But otherwise, it's a flat $30, unlimited home and away program off peak. So it's 0.0 is the energy charge. But I would say even more importantly, bigger, especially when you're looking at the Texas grid and some of the highlights coming out of the Texas storms, is you're seeing the market step up, and these battery packs that are coming in the market are huge. If you look at the Ford F-150 Lightning advertisement, the very first feature they put on the Ford isn't the torque or isn't the horsepower or the towing, which is normally what would Ford do. It is a picture of the Ford plugged into a home and providing 3 to 10 days of emergency power during a time of storm. And even the photography has their house, even the outdoor patio lighting is on, and the whole neighborhood is dark, almost like mocking them. And then to put that battery pack into perspective, Ford hasn't released the specifications, but the professionals say it's about 130 to 180 kilowatt hour packs to do the range and the performance of what Ford is saying it's going to do. A Tesla Powerwall is 10 kilowatt hours. So this is the equivalent of having about 15 Tesla Powerwalls with wheels on it to provide emergency and backup power. Also, any projection, when you look at batteries, 80% plus is going to have wheels attached. It's going to be for EVs. So as a utility, you really need to understand what this new ubiquitous storage means to you and your customers and what it can mean to the grid. Because I look at EVs as not a threat to the grid, another user. It is actually an enabler for more resiliency and more affordability. One, because it's storage, but two, is the load shape of EV charging is completely different than what we spend billions of dollars on, and that's infrastructure for the traditional load, which is buildings and air conditioning. So I think it's a really great opportunity for grid operators and utilities to take advantage of increased EVs onto the grid.
Thanks, Karl. It's great to hear about that one customer. It's always the exception that proves the rule. Jeff, going to turn to you. As I laid out in sort of the opening remarks, the rural territories are where some of the biggest challenges are. What solutions are utilities exploring to ensure adequate and reliable electric service at remote locations?
So we haven't gone so far as to put battery storage out yet, but it does require some build out. So most of the buildings that we have at best are served at 12208 3-phase. We have a lot of locations that don't even have 3-phase, there's just single phase lines there. So we have to kind of pick our choose our locations, and we're putting in 480 volt transformers because a fast charger, all of them take 480 volts. But that said, the build out we're doing is just 50 kW chargers initially. And that fills the gap that we have right now, but we recognize that longer term, it'll take more than that. So almost all of those sites are built to go to at least 300 kW. So looking to the future and expansion and maybe changing out those chargers, and you think, gee, you just put a charger in and you're talking about changing it out already. But our vision is that those 50 kW ones can go to a fleet or a school bus operation or something, and then we can upgrade to bigger chargers when the demand for charging gets there, so that that justifies it.
Great, thanks. And next question, Jeff Allen, I was already ahead of you on this one. I want to talk a little bit about rate structures, and Simon, I'm going to give this one to you. Particularly demand charges. Those rate structures can make or break the EV charging business case. Are there model rates or other examples that would enable EV adoption while allowing utilities to adequately cover their costs?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we looked at very heavily as we looked at creating rate structures to help advance adoption. And the structure that we've implemented right now is a 3-tiered structure based on usage tiers. And we've actually eliminated demand charges with these time of use EV rates. We've just wiped demand charges out entirely for the first 5 years of these rates. And then they phase back in incrementally over another 5 years, so that at the end of the 10-year period of this rate implementation, the demand charges are actually a smaller component than they were prior to these rates being put in place. Knowing full well that in a 10-year period of time, it's very conceivable that we'll go back and look at rates again and make those adjustments. But the reason for that removal of the demand charges is really twofold. One is we recognize that sometimes is the greatest fear to a fleet that's making an adjustment. And back to what I mentioned in my opening remarks, demand charges are not such a big impact for a small EV operator, but they can be a tremendous impact for a large, let's say like a transit fleet. But we also recognize that a transit fleet is not, if they've got a fleet of 100 buses, they're not changing out 100 buses on day one. They might be changing out 10 buses per year over a 10-year period of time. And so that initial delivery of 10 buses, that demand charge, if it's in the rate, could be extremely impactful. But as time goes on and the fleet gets larger, they will get more control of their charging cycle, more control of their managed charging as well as the usage of the vehicles, and that'll flatten that demand out. And so the idea behind that 5-year holiday and then the 5-year ramp in is that matches as fleets make those full transitions. As new technology comes on board, managed charging, and as the fleets become fully electrified, then demand becomes far less of an impact because they've got a much more steady rate flow of power from the utility to through their meter. And so I think that's really the approach that we found to be very effective. It allows our fleets that are making those transitions to have very predictable fuel costs in the early years. And again, gives the fleets that are looking at just dipping their toe in the water or really aren't sure which technology they want to go with, it gives them that ability to try a couple of different things at a pilot presentation, if you will, before they make a full decision on what they're going to do for their full implementation of electric vehicles.
Thanks, Simon. Karl, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this one as well. I know you've got some thoughts about pricing models that are supportive of this issue.
Well, certainly. So one, I would talk about the pricing model to the customer, and maybe I'm going against the grain here, where you see states like California looking to, mandating kilowatt hour as being the measurement of choice. Here in Texas, or at least my official stance, I support a market competition on not only who provides infrastructure and territories. So Austin Energy was one of the very first public powers to lobby for a change in city code to clearly allow third-party providers in their territory, because there was a little shade of gray. State of Texas law just recently caught up a few months ago with a Senate bill that did pass and get signed that clarifies if you're providing EV charging, you're not electric service provider. So that was kind of the shade of gray. We do per minute to the customer. One is we think it more effectively, relates to the cost of service, which is just a core kind of utility principle, because it's about the $100,000 per port asset cost. So that's a depreciation cost. It's not the 6 cents or so per kilowatt hour energy charge. So when you're reflecting closer to the cost of service, but maybe just as importantly, we think it will improve the customer experience. What we're seeing is when you have a plug in and plug out, so we decided to go 21 cents plug in and plug out, the average visit is 17 minutes. If you did kilowatt hour charge, we think the average session would be closer to 45 minutes on DC fast. And the big reason is because you're not encouraging people to basically get on and get off. And even though the California ruling allows for what's called idling charges, when Tesla first launched kind of unlimited charging, people would plug into their DC fast and hop on an airplane. So it would just be, you'd freeze out this charge. I mean, we talked to them, we talked to a lot of utilities, a lot of people before we came out my rate. So the good news is at least California does allow for an idling charge to avoid that. But what it doesn't seem to allow for is basically a degradation charge. Is every EV right around 80% full will turn your 100,000, 200,000 plus charging port, depending on the speed you're allowing it, into a $2,000 level 2 charger to 6.6 kW to protect the battery so you don't overheat the battery. So in some ways you're doing kind of fake idling. You're just trickle charging. And if there's not, so maybe go see a movie and do a DC fast versus we'd rather have someone get a cup of coffee on their DC fast. So we think that's important. And then from the actual, utility bill to the customer, we have launched our own pilot tariff for infrastructure. So it's fleet or DC fast hub, slightly different approach to kind of double down on how small the energy charge is. So our pilot infrastructure still has a demand charge, but the energy charge is 0.00. So what we think that will do is still have the same effect. It will encourage people to imagine, well, the more I can keep energy flowing out, because I'm not paying for all the energy flowing out, the more efficient I will be. And so our local transit authority they will probably be one of the first customers, but it's open to anyone who's providing EV chargers. And they seem to think based on now how they model around that, they could have a fuel savings of an additional, around tens of millions. I can't share their numbers, but significant millions of dollars of additional savings by aligning their kind of how they are able to charge a bus fleet in alignment with basically unlimited kilowatt hour charges.
That's great. Stacey, I'd like to return to your aviation metaphor. You have a 30,000-foot view of a lot of this stuff across all the utilities and all the service territories. Are there specific regulatory or policy frameworks that can support utilities' objectives and enable EV adoption? And we had a question in chat, and I think this is another good one as well, is that balance and tension between utility ownership of the charging and making those investments in make-ready investments. Can you kind of talk about that balance? Is there a trend at all of a shift toward more make-ready and less about the utility ownership model?
I don't necessarily. Let me rephrase. I don't have the data at my fingertips to back up that it's shifting from a approval perspective. We definitely are seeing more filings, more proposals with that make-ready model. Some of it coming from, wanting the customer to have skin in the game, sharing, both the costs and the benefits, I guess, more broadly in that respect. But to back up from a policy framework perspective, or I guess the 30,000-foot view, is that no two territories are the same. No two utility territories are the same, and we've got a great representation here of just because some program design or policy works in one doesn't mean it's going to work in another. And I think when you look across the body of filings, many of those are taking into consideration they should be taking into consideration their unique market. So if EVs just haven't taken off quite yet, the idea is we know that they're coming. So what can the utility do to prepare? Maybe take smaller steps. Going back to Karl's, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. I think the same goes with if you're not doing something right now, to at least engage stakeholders and have those conversations around what does everyone need, what could this look like in our territory, to just get started. Probably behind the curve. The states that are asking their utilities to take a step back and do the planning process, very focused on transportation electrification. I personally am a fan of that approach, whether it's coming from the legislative body or the regulatory commission. Similarly, there's some good examples of the working group process that is going on in some states that bring together many of those that are on the phone right now. The state agencies, the municipal organizations, just kind of bringing everyone to the table and having them talk through what should these programs look like. But if the different entities are not talking to each other quite yet, you may get in a situation like with federal funding coming, that you want to get ready as far in advance as possible, and that may not be necessarily putting a policy out there. It may just be having a conversation and engaging the right stakeholders early.
That's great. And I'm going to use that to transition into our lightning round with the time we have remaining. Jeff, I'm going to call on you first. Thank you to everyone that's joined us today for this webinar. We've got a lot of state energy offices. We've got a lot of transportation offices, utilities. What's your key takeaway for our audience on this topic? What's the one thing they should be focused on going into the future?
So I think doing everything you can to enable utilities to be involved, whether it be in the make-ready or it be in the actual ownership. I mean, I think we've seen some efforts to kind of keep utilities out in the past, and that's been a fail. You need to have utilities engaged in the EV charging infrastructure build out to make it work and to make it happen. That's my main point, I guess.
Thanks, Jeff. Simon, I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah, I'll double down on something Karl mentioned earlier, and that's that MEO component of it. Really, the marketing and the outreach. What are we doing as the utility industry to help our operators, whether they be light duty or fleet operators, really understand charging infrastructure and how that integrates with the utility system? I think there's a lot of terrific technology providers and OEMs out there providing a lot of product knowledge to EV users. But there's a big gap in understanding what does that look like when it connects to the utility, and how can the utility be a partner in that rather than an adversary.
Great, thanks, Simon. Karl, over to you.
My two thoughts, my plead of all this great regulatory policy knowledge here is, one is there is a lot of government subsidy funds on infrastructure, and I think we really need to be careful and support open standards. You saw from the big bipartisan infrastructure plan within 24 hours, Elon Musk, owner of Tesla, tweeted, hey, we're going to start allowing everyone. I mean, shame on us if we support proprietary networks and we strand someone in their Nissan Leaf right next to a beautiful 36 DC fast Tesla hub. And you're seeing other car manufacturers seeing what Tesla has been able to do, this competitive advantage with a proprietary network. Rivian, I love their product, but they're doing the same thing. So they're going to have their own, only Rivian trucks can charge on Rivian DC fast. Only Teslas can charge on Teslas only. So I think we really need to double down and not give a penny of these government funds unless you're supporting an open standard. And quite frankly, the open standard here in the US really should be CCS, maybe a small percentage to CHAdeMO as well, but CCS really is the dominant standard, and focus focus on that. So I'll just say that would be my top plead, is how we're leveraging these government funds, and let's support open standards and make it happen.
Great, thanks, Karl. Stacy, bring us home.
Sure, bringing it back to the state agencies on the phone. A lot of you are in the midst of Volkswagen settlement funding, and are probably maybe shaking a little bit about what is this federal tidal wave going to look like and feel like. And I think I would just say, think about the programs that you have in place, what's working, what's not, and how can you use this opportunity to capitalize on the best practices, on those really great collaborative relationships that should include the utility, to Jeff's point, and move forward with confidence that you're in a great position to help a lot of people electrify across a lot of different use cases we didn't even get into in detail. It's not just the light duty passenger vehicle anymore. So go forth and use what you know, what you have. And I think there's a lot of very smart, people that are ready to jump in and help.
Great, thanks, Stacy. And please join me in thanking our panelists for this one. I know this one was high octane, very provocative based on how much feedback we're getting and conversation in chat. Thank you all for participating on that. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your points and questions, but the debate continues and we look forward to continuing this conversation with this community of practice. Thank you so much, NASEO and Cassie. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks a bunch, David, and thanks to all of our panelists for that stimulating conversation. And so we have come to the end of our event. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. We do want to make just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. As David mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, this summit kicks off an initiative with NASEO and the Department of Energy, NREL, and some of our other partners to try to understand what technical assistance needs the states and the municipalities need when preparing for widespread EV infrastructure rollout, particularly in light of some of the massive federal funding opportunities that may become available this fall. And so we are going to be hosting a series of deep dive workshops to take a closer look at some of the issues discussed during our summit. We wanted to share the dates: October 27th, November 16th, and December 7th. This will be for state agencies to explore some specific issues, and those issues will be announced in the next week or two. We'll be able to share those with all of those who have registered for this meeting. And also we'll be working with our partners, AASHTO, NACA, NARUC, and NGA, as well as EEI, NRECA, and APPA, to make sure that folks have information about these meetings. I will also mention that we will be sending a quick survey out to everyone who has attended this meeting, just to get a little bit of feedback, not only on the summit, but importantly, some of the barriers that you all are facing that will help to inform some of the content of the upcoming workshops. And the results of all of these discussions will be an interactive online tool that state agencies will be able to use, not only to connect with tools, but to connect